Oh my god, where to start? I'm Hushcho, and hello, and holy shit, what the fuck. And I'm not really saying this because the show was so surreal I can't process it or anything like that. I'm saying it because the series was so audaciously disappointing that I don't have the words adequate to describe it. Now Apocalypse was a show that should have been a delight from start to finish. A stylish, surreal comedy that also happened to have major cosmic overtones. The series started with one of the overall strongest and most enjoyable first episodes I've seen in a while, which made me very optimistic about this, at least superficially, strongly queer and sex-positive story. But it ended up that the cosmic stuff was window dressing that just got more pedestrian and pretentious every time it surfaced, usually as the most unwelcome part of whatever happened to be going on that episode. And the queer stuff wasn't as enlightened as it thought it was, and the sex positivity was just self-loathing in transparent disguise. It's like the song goes, love is an angel disguised as lust, lying here in our beds until the morning comes. Which might have inspired this whole series by itself. There's a central thread to the plot that isn't particularly compelling, but compared to everything else that's going on, it's like a drink of water after a stroll through the desert. Ostensibly, the story of the show is mostly focused around Ulysses Zane, but feel free to forget that because everyone in the show mostly calls him Yuli, and his name, despite being kind of an obviously pretentious reference, is absolutely unimportant and not significant. Just like pretty much every other character that shows up with an important name, Yuli's evocative name never really ends up being a completed metaphor. Like seemingly everything else in this series, it's something that seems designed to add weight to something essentially without any. Which would have been fine if the show had maintained its lighter, more comedic tone that more strongly asserted itself in the first episode, and then less with every subsequent episode. By the time the last episode aired, it was pretty obvious that comedy, laughter, and smiling was no longer a priority if it had ever been. But Ulysses randomly hooks up with a guy who seems damaged and kind of inaccessible. It ends up kind of driving Yuli nuts because it's Tyler Posey, and he actually does a fantastic job of giving a pretty nothing character a tremendous degree of pathos, and even makes him quite a bit ominous. And that ties into the visions and dreams that Yuli keeps having, which seem to indicate that Gabriel, that's Cutie Posey, is none other than the apocalyptic archangel trumpeter, and that he's getting ready to blow his horn. First, he has to trade handjobs with Yuli and then ghost him for pretty much the rest of the series. Now feel free to forget that, because aside from a few minutes here and there, it's not important or relevant. Additionally, nothing will come of it. You can make up your mind if it was really anything, or if Ulysses dreamt or hallucinated it all, because that's also not out of the realm of possibility. Because while it's indicated to us that he has visions, everyone seems to dismiss them as just him smoking too much weed. Just for a little aside here, cannabis is not chemically addictive and does not tend to, unless significantly overdosed, cause hallucinations. Even someone who gets high all day every day isn't likely to have that happen. And if it does happen, you're definitely not as functional as Yuli is in this series. Yuli, whom, I will note, has a clear experience with hallucinogens, since he uses the experience of shrooms in a descriptive way. I point this out because it would have been really easy to have him just tripping on acid or any hallucinogen, perhaps shrooms, which, as you might guess from the name, will cause hallucinations. But everyone, including Ulysses himself, starts to think that maybe he smokes too much and it's causing him to hallucinate, which really makes everyone seem like kind of a gigantic asshole because their friend is having traumatic experiences and they're gaslighting him or just being incredibly dismissive. I don't know if Greg was going for some kind of message with the weed, but I wasn't there for it. The only thing I know for sure is that by the time Carly suggests Yuli lay off the weed because of a new relationship prospect, the show's insufferable, and it only gets worse, making me think that Ulysses giving up cannabis is a huge move for the worse, even temporarily. The script seems to want us to see it the opposite way, since Yuli's into the relationship that never actually happens, but by that point, the writing and the audience are so far removed from each other, they're practically opposing sides. It's not even a spoiler to say that the last thing that happens in the series is that Yuli seemingly sees Gabriel again, then a dumbass character we were supposed to dislike extremely gets ass-fucked by a reptilian alien. That's it, that's the end of the joke. Series, whatever. I assume they didn't know the difference either. But the thing is, this is a major problem because that's the only real attempt at an actual moving narrative we get. Literally everything else is completely pointless wasting time. No other characters actually end up getting much of anything to do. The only three characters who really seem to have any agency in the story are Ulysses, his himbo roommate Ford, and his BFF Carly. And the only one who does anything at all that moves the story or develops himself as a character is Yuli. Carly, to a lesser extent, manages to get out of a relationship she thought she didn't like, then loved, then hated again, and that is literally the only thing she accomplishes. At least, it's the only thing that they still remember by the end, and let us remember. Similarly, Ford has a whole roller coaster storyline with a producer named Barnabas, who may be a reptile alien in disguise, but it never follows up any storyline. And it goes nowhere, leaving him actually the only one of the three to be appreciably worse off than where he started. The guy who played Dick Dickey in Eating Out Drama Camp, which was the best of that whole series, makes a rather unwelcome appearance in one of the episodes, and I have to say he plays insufferable characters too well. So well that I never want to see him in anything ever again, please. Carly ends up in an inexplicable situation after producing an extremely successful independent production that's so well received she tries to sell it to Starz, the same garbage fire of a network that ran Now Apocalypse. In a surreal move, her most dedicated cam fan, probably because they couldn't afford all the other actors from the first couple of episodes, is the single person hearing her pitch and doesn't realize it's her until she walks in the door, I think. And we never see the meeting. We are just left to assume, based on subsequent conversations, that it went badly, somehow. It never bothers to tell us anything about it, and the guy never shows up again, which is how these storylines tend to go. A character appears, they pay the actor, which you can tell from the previously on at the beginning who's going to appear in any given episode because they're too cheap to spring for appearance rights if they're not in the episode. And then the story comes to a point where it is never brought up again, and you never see the once extremely important-seeming character ever again. This is kind of an operating philosophy for Now Apocalypse. The first really major story that goes absolutely nowhere is Carly's acting teacher, who is super obviously into Carly. Carly comes over to the woman's house, which she apparently knows the address of and has been to before, since she invites her over and doesn't give her any address or information. The woman then suddenly goes off on a men are bad tangent and kind of both reads Carly for filth and has a meltdown, which was acted very realistically, but the problem is, not only did it add nothing to Carly's story or the woman's, the teacher is never seen again. It's tied up in the scene, and Carly is told not to bother coming back to class next week. But see, here's the thing. You can't be an accredited teacher of any kind if you're just hemorrhaging students because they don't want to fuck you. That's all kinds of not happening. It would have been so much more interesting, not to mention have so much more possibility, to either have Carly return to the class determined to hone her skill, or have her hook up with the teacher even just once. Or they could have, had the woman not suddenly have a psychotic break, or even, if they really wanted things to go down this way, have Carly be forced to take action because of her teacher doing what she did. It did none of those things. And the way it presented the blow-up, it wasn't even clear what Greg wanted us to think about it. Many of the things the woman says end up kind of true in one way or another, and though her degree of intense anger is not at all called for, she has some uncomfortably accurate points. She's shown smoking up earlier, so it's unknown if that was the writing trying to introduce a motif, or if it was just that she has anxiety, and the blow-up was supposed to be her insecurity prompting an anxiety attack. But it's the thing that ends up being the real beginning of the end, just like the episode title. It's where it stops being fun and stops being funny. It's no longer a half-hour quirky funny show about the surreal life of pretty people in LA. Now it's a half-hour of self-important misery that gets shittier every time you return to it. It is, perhaps ironically or by design somehow, reflected in Carly's relationship with Jethro, her idiot boyfriend. We're introduced to them, and Carly isn't that into him. He's kind of funny at first, but he really overstays his welcome in the narrative and becomes as tiresome to us as he is to Carly. She only finally breaks up with him in the final scene of the final episode, really, and that's after playing with the idea of being into Severin, Ford's emotionally inaccessible girlfriend, fucking a dude who apparently has cerebral palsy, but not wanting to commit to anything with him, and becoming a remarkable success at independent production, which no one in the script ever really gives enough attention. It's like Carly's relationship with Jethro is the one Greg thinks he has with the audience. But see, the thing is, we're not a bunch of dumb straight boys who are going to keep coming back for the promise of sex. It was, at first, a little refreshing to see a series that sort of frankly deals with sex, albeit always avoiding showing anything, but it gets old really fast. To bring in something from my own creative career, I started off my work at a host where I was required to shoehorn sex into my work. No matter how creative you get, it's just not going to stay exciting for very long. Sex is not inherently interesting, I'm sad to say. I reached the point where I just skipped through the sex scenes. They blow their wad, you could say, very early on. The one element that's both plot-related and sex-related that was very interesting was Yuli and Gabriel giving each other a handjob in the alley on their first meeting. Was this significant? Maybe. But we'll never know because so many seemingly important plot points were discarded without even the slightest ceremony or respect, and the alley handjob is the only sexual interaction between any characters that has any kind of really fantastic element. The cliffhangers aren't cliffhangers, and I both sort of like and at the same time hate this. I've always hated unnecessary cliffhangers, and I especially hate season cliffhangers. But I just do not enjoy being strung along from one episode to the next, never able to just take a breath and enjoy a complete story or a segment of one. Now Apocalypse tries to do both, and so it fails at trying to do both. It both tries to have cliffhangers every time and not. And every time the next episode starts without addressing the problem from the cliffhanger, and later the characters inevitably flash back to explain what happened and how they got out of the situation. I wouldn't have so much trouble with it if it only happened once. Once, it would actually be an interesting and different way to subvert the cliffhanger itself. But when it happens every time that the cliffhanger is only explained, addressed, or in any way dealt with later, in retrospect, that makes for tedious and bad writing. You may remember from my many videos about American Horror Story Apocalypse that there are a number of problems with using flashbacks too casually and too frequently. But it tends to boil down to the audience having little connection and meager stakes with overuse of flashbacks. They know what they can observe as having happened, and they're usually able to make assumptions successfully, connecting where they were last and where they are in the present of the story. When I started this series, it blew me away. The way the story starts out, it evokes love and youth and a familiar and surreal world. It made me think of younger days, free in a way that I never was as a child, finally able to face life on my own terms. It at least makes LA sometimes seem like an identifiable place, even if most of the time it's presented as bizarre and incomprehensible. There is a brightness at the first episode that fades almost instantly, unfortunately, but for a brief twinkling moment, it's heady and intoxicating. Then the series completely makes sure to sever any mistaken identification with Yuli. The skeevy, bisexual energy this show gave off was beyond off-putting. The Palm Springs episode was probably the most useless episode of the whole series, and it shattered any last lingering anything with Ulysses. He acts completely out of character established before then. He meets a crackpot author, which as usual comes to nothing at all, and the character never appears, nor is he mentioned ever again. Then Yuli decides to go all in with some rando chick at a party after turning two guys down for really no reason. I thought the Steely Dan drop was kinda funny, and the actress was great. It's just that it, tanks the story, the character, and the situation, and even makes Yuli look like an even worse friend, since he was presumably not taking up the guys who asked him on their threesome because he was trying to look out for Ford. And what happened? Ford got his ass drugged and just about raped. Great job, dipshit. And of course, as if that wasn't bad enough, they keep bringing up Yuli's hookup and even pick it up the next episode, which as usual adds nothing to what's going on and goes nowhere. And I sure love it when they bring back an element from a previous episode to do nothing with it and just remind us of what a gross and not gay character Yuli's become in the course of 5 half hours. You can't have your cake and eat it too, Greg. Every character isn't a little bisexual. Every person being a little bi is the line insecure gay dudes tell bi-curious guys to make them feel less awkward about experimenting a little bit. And the fact is that we need a whole lot more actual gayness that isn't turned into bisexuality because that's more socially acceptable to largely the straight boy 20-something demographic you're apparently hoping to get with this show. It isn't still 1990, man. For better or for worse, it's 2021, and that apocalypse motif you like so much is here. I should really know better, than to get too excited about possible representation as complex dynamic characters. We needed a dynamic gay guy. That's not a gay guy that just happens to have sex sometimes with women, no matter how cute the woman is or how bewildering the reference may be. Asia was kind of a throwaway joke, and despite how cute she was and was played, she managed to be basically the last straw for a show that blazed nothing so much as goodwill. We could have had a gay main character who was the main protagonist acting in the main storyline of the plot. Instead, we apparently have a service top who had to have some kind of bisexual cred that added nothing to the story and, yet again, went absolutely nowhere. To say that Yuli is written as a hungry bottom is like saying the ocean's a bit moist. Before I started watching the show, I only had gifs to go by. I assumed that at some point Yuli and Ford hooked up and Ford, wanting love as well as physical affection, latched onto Yuli, who was just in it for the sex. But alas, that would have been far more interesting and far more gay than they clearly wanted to go. Yuli and Ford, despite having a good chemistry, never do anything other than a brief, mild fantasy sequence that, like almost everything else in the series, goes nowhere and leads to nothing. In fact, most every scene, once it's gone, can be forgotten, for all you'll need it later. I would not be surprised if they weren't counting on that, in fact, after having watched it. If anything comes up as a thread from before, you're reminded of it a little too adequately. It's like a particularly condescending stoner program that knows its audience but maybe tries too hard because it doesn't have a high enough opinion of its viewers. But the thing is, it only works if you're trying to remind stoners why you need them to find what's going on in this episode important. It doesn't work quite as well if you're reminding people of something you did a poor job of presenting in the first place in a show where you're not giving your viewers any reason or reward for paying attention. If anything, they're dissuaded from retaining anything, because you'll just jingle that particular set of keys in front of them when you're ready to pick up that character or plot point. But all of this is remarkably irrelevant when nothing ever leads to anything. Nothing means anything. All of the drama is completely artificial. We have exactly zero reliable proof that any of it even happened in-universe at all, much less the fantastical elements. It could not only have been a dream by Yuli, it could have also been virtually anything else. And aside from that, nothing has any weight in it because you also never know when a plot is going to just be dropped unceremoniously and never turn up again. Ultimately, the last leg of the story is the roughest. Severin ends up coming off like the only real adult in the affair, and she's clearly written for us to think that she's a bitch. But Ford is desperately needy, and that becomes super apparent from his many breakdowns. And Sev really is not a bitch. Though this doesn't matter because instead of actual development, she just gets to do nothing useful or relevant except for masturbate while watching an exhibitionist neighbor for a couple of episodes. I mean, her name's pretty on the nose. She's a severe person, but as with many series, the character we're not supposed to like is the one I actually ended up liking, usually because they actually say what we're thinking and actually call out the main characters for the shit they do. Carly bumblefucks around with Jethro and I just don't care, and Yuli has a truly cringe relationship with a man named Isaac who has as much screen presence as a piece of soggy bread and a void where chemistry should be with Ulysses. They spent multiple episodes on this boring-ass motherfucker who, I am sorry, neither lives up to the dialogue written around him nor the dialogue that comes from his mouth. He is a handsome actor, but he's surrounded by way more visually engaging people. They repeatedly try to build him up through dialogue, but you can't do that because we can see him. It feels like another case of the script not giving viewers enough credit for having eyes that see or minds that are capable of any thought whatsoever. Ford gets dumped by Severin and meets some weird woman named Cleopatra who, you guessed it, has a meaningless but significant sounding name. In the whole series, nothing about Ford's sexuality is ever tested or pushed that much. Threesomes? Always two women. Sure, he drops by an orgy once, and doesn't get that freaky considering the actor was clearly up for a lot of variety that went completely unseen aside from one brief scene in the very first episode. We're supposed to find him appealing, but we're never allowed to connect to him because, Greg, we're a bunch of homos, and you made him a sexual object that you then decided to make sure was out of reach. And you never ever, not even once, let us play with him. But it was sure super fucking important you had Yuli talk about banging a random chick rolling on E. You also had to have him into eating her out and talking about a sexual power dynamic that, say it with me again, never goes anywhere or comes to anything. No pun intended. Also, not easy to achieve a climax when you're rolling. And in case you think that's an understandable oversight, it took me an impressive 15 seconds to find that fact online. Ignorance really is no excuse. I'm so tired of having things that would be satisfying or interesting or even just fun to me being sidelined by either the easy gay of girls that are into girls but might fuck you, Johnny Straight Boy, or the not really gay of cock-sucking slut boys who really love pounding a vag because you're just not manly otherwise, mask for mask, no femmes lol. In case you've been under a rock for the past 20 or so years, this is like the very definition of problematic. I'm sure it wasn't the only reason the show failed, because there are so many other compelling reasons not to like it, but it can't have helped to retain the gay audience. Avin Jogia and Bomirshov being in various states of undress can't keep a viewership. They're nice to look at, but people can just look at pictures of them. They only watch an actual moving film to see acting and a story they can engage with and enjoy. Now Apocalypse sabotaged its actors frequently, and the story is unreachable and pointless. It is a textbook waste of time. It makes Seinfeld look intensely focused and purposeful. They could have had Ford frequently going around to high society events and dragging Yuli along, could have developed the reptilian alien conspiracy by showing more of them in disguise like they seemingly indicated with Barnabas, and could have had Ulysses start to actually understand what he brings to the table and what he's up against. Severin's own strange affairs could be tied into that very easily, and Carly could be tied to it unknowingly, since she's apparently affected by the good and bad luck that comes with reptilian aliens or something, I don't know. It was not a particularly coherent story. When I get down to it, I think the whole story could be resolved by just one thing in the end. Just leave LA. If your life is this shit, and a lot of it is because you live in LA, get out of LA. Shit or get off the pot too. Either go all in and have this deal with Yuli getting into what he's seeing and trying to be proactive and save the world, or have it be about the glamorous and enviable lives of weird pretty people in LA. Because what we have in Now Apocalypse is, instead of that, a compelling reason to avoid Los Angeles forever. But this is another of the show's major problems, which is a complete aversion to commitment. It's even a kind of a leitmotif of the story. No one wants to commit to anything. Everyone's trying not to linger too long. But when everyone's trying to leave, it's hard to keep an audience invested. It tries so desperately to hold on to characters no one wants around, but it won't do enough with the few characters it introduces who are actually interesting or somewhat charismatic. The sound is great. The soundtrack is pretty fantastic, and the visuals are gripping, though I can only imagine that most of the things Yuli wears are probably things from Avin's closet. The production doesn't seem particularly lavish, but it does enough with its budget to be convincing. Paired with the terrible and uneven story, though, that's not exactly a glowing review. The actors mostly do decent jobs, even the sometimes jarring cameos of characters who show up for 5 minutes and never again, super worth a paid singing role that surely wasn't trying to fill up runtime. Not all of the actors are great though, and sometimes it very much seems like otherwise good actors weren't given good direction or support, which makes it weird because at other times there's such a strict seeming direction that appears to obsess over minutiae that never pay off. Avin Jogia, of course, has a huge amount of charm and natural charisma, but he can't create a likable and compelling character out of what the script gives him. If they had leaned in any direction that wasn't mainstream straight boy pandering, maybe it would have worked better. If the production ever really committed to much, maybe that would have helped. But I'm Joe, and you're welcome, and I'll see you again. Bye.